Kenji Yoshino is the Chief Justice Earl Warren Professor of Constitutional Law at the NYU School of Law and the Director of the Meltzer Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging. A graduate of Harvard, Oxford, and Yale, he specializes in constitutional law, anti-discrimination law, and law and literature. Yoshino has been published in major academic journals and has written for the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. He makes regular appearances on radio and television programs such as NPR, CNN, PBS, and MSNBC. He is the author of 3 books, covering the hidden assault on our civil rights, 1,000 Times More Fair, What Shakespeare's Plays Teach Us About Justice, and Speak Now, Marriage Equality on Trial. David Glasgow is the Executive Director of the Meltzer Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging, and an adjunct professor of law at NYU School of Law. He has co-taught the courses at the Law School on Leadership, Diversity, and Inclusion. He attended the University of Melbourne and the NYU School of Law, where he received the David H. Moses Memorial Prize and the George Collin Award. Prior to joining the Meltzer Center, he practiced employee relations and anti-discrimination law in Melbourne, Australia, and then served as Associate Director of the Public Interest Law Center at NYU School of Law. Jane Park is the CEO of Athena Consumer, an all-women-founded special purpose acquisition company, as well as CEO and founder of Toki, a social and sustainable gift wrap company. Prior to founding Toki, Ms. Park was the CEO and founder of the online-first beauty brand Julep, as well as the founding director of the CEO Forum for Education and Technology. Yoshino and Glasgow's latest book, Say the Right Thing, is the subject of this talk tonight. So please join me in welcoming Kenji Yoshino, David Glasgow, and Jane Park.
Thanks for braving all of the traffic, apparently, that's out there to be here with us tonight. We're so excited to have this conversation. I am so excited about this book because reading it, it's amazing to find people who are so brilliant and thoughtful write something that is so useful and helpful. It's like when a Michelin star chef makes you a great burger. And please, as we're going through, add your own questions, especially if I think there's a QR code that you can submit questions to, which will show up in my iPad right here. All right, well, without further ado, can you tell me, David, why did you write this book?
So we wrote this book because Kenji and I work at a research center at NYU, and we consult with a lot of organizations and individuals on how to build inclusive cultures. And we kept noticing a problem recur over and over, which was that a lot of people who want to get involved in diversity and inclusion efforts are terrified of saying the wrong thing. And so what happens is they withdraw in fear, opt out from participating in a lot of efforts as allies that we wish that they would participate in. And so we wanted to write a book, a practical, shame-free book, giving people some tools for how to navigate these tricky conversations about identity so that people could overcome their fear and show up as allies.
How many times a day do you think you worry that you are saying the wrong thing?
All the time.
And you wrote a book. So Kenji, why do you think we're finding it harder than ever to have conversations about our identity experiences?
Yeah, so first of all, Jane, thank you so much for being our conversation partner tonight. Thank you to Seattle Town Hall, and thank you all for coming. It's so exciting to be here with you. So I think there's actually a very hopeful reason why these conversations seem to be everywhere these days and may seem even less avoidable than they were even a decade ago. So I think about this as what the kind of political writer Matt Iglesias calls a great awakening, where he says what's different about the past few years is that you see a lot of allies, non-Black people going to Black Lives Matter rallies, men going to the Women's March in Washington, straight and cisgender people being allies to the LGBTQ+ community, And that's a really hopeful sign. It means that, to quote the Yale professor Jennifer Richardson, there's been a democratization of discomfort, where it used to be that the more kind of minority group or subordinated group had to bear the entire discomfort of a conversation, so that if I said something inappropriate as a man to a woman, that the woman would have to sort of suck it up and deal with all of the discomfort from the conversation, and I would be kind of blithely oblivious to the fact that anything had been amiss in that conversation. So now with the rise of allyship and a more kind of culture of being more diverse and more inclusive as a society, I think it's balanced out a little bit. But the upshot of that is that we do experience some discomfort, right, when we enter into these conversations, and they do seem to be everywhere. And I think what David and I are trying to do in this book is to say, I think we're constantly told you have to be uncomfortable in these conversations if you want to get anywhere, and we do believe that to some extent. But we don't want that discomfort to turn into such distress, as David was talking about, that you opt out of having the conversation altogether.
It seems like your book is really helpful with helping people expect discomfort, to sort of anticipate it and know what to do about it. So David, you write in the book that no one can afford to sit out on these conversations, sort of related to what Kenji was just saying. But why do you think that now?
So just think about all the different domains of life that we enter into, and I think you'll sort of see that these conversations are becoming increasingly inescapable. So in workplaces, it's more likely now than at any other point in history that you will get training on implicit bias or privilege or opportunities to participate in racial equity task forces or in gender equity efforts, or that the company will participate in pride marches, or that there'll be a chief diversity officer. There's been a huge surge in hiring of actual diversity professionals. So in workplaces, these conversations are happening. Certainly in universities and other educational contexts in high schools. I mean, even down to elementary schools and preschools now are having conversations increasingly about issues of identity and diversity. So there's certainly all the way through the pipeline you're going to encounter it. And then we can't really remember a time when we looked at our morning news feed and didn't encounter at least some conversations about identity. So it might be all of the movements that Kenji was talking about, like Black Lives Matter or the Me Too movement or LGBTQ rights, the controversies around critical race theory, trans rights, and so forth. So if you are a consumer of the media and you go to dinner parties or you talk to people at family barbecues or around the Thanksgiving table, even there, I think, when you're not in the workplace or in school, you're increasingly likely to encounter these conversations. And especially because younger people coming into a lot of these organizations are driving these conversations as well. So some of the people we spoke to in writing the book told us, when Gen Zers come into my organization, they want to talk about the white supremacy in my company. And that's extremely confronting for me as a manager. And so I think a lot of that generational pressure that is happening is also making these conversations inescapable.
What are some of the most common mistakes that people make in conversations about identity? I love all the examples that you have in your book, because I think we can all put ourselves into them. But maybe you could share some of the mistakes that you've made in your life?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, I borrow this from my wonderful colleague at NYU, Dolly Chug, where she begins many of her classes by flashing up a slide of a professor. And she says, look at this terrible professor. This professor misgendered a trans colleague, confused two people of the same ethnic group with each other and called them by each other's names. This professor had a syllabus that was stacked towards historically dominant groups without any justification for that. This professor laughed at inappropriate jokes. And you see where this is headed. The next slide is, and that professor was me, right? So I can raise my hand and cop to all four of those bad actions and say I too have engaged in those activities, which is not to say I'm proud of that or I don't want to get better, but I think it's a really useful point to say this is all of us. None of us gets to sit on the sidelines and to say I'm just here as an ally. If you think about it as there's the ally, there's the affected person, and then there's the source of non-inclusive behavior. That's a game of musical chairs, right? Some days you're the ally, I saw it. Some days you're the affected person, it happened to me. And then on other days, you're the source of non-inclusive behavior, you did it. right? And so because this is a game of musical chairs, we're all going to fall into these errors at some point. And I think the first thing that we can do is just to admit that we're all fallible in this domain, as in any other.
I thought it was really interesting that, David, that in that trio, you talk about how we have to have empathy for the source. And that is, of all the different ideas in your book, was one of the most startling to me, that you would call for that. And can you talk a little bit more about why, if we have empathy, shouldn't we save it for the affected person? Why have empathy for the source?
Yeah, well, one of the reasons why we think that you should have, empathy and generosity toward the person who makes these mistakes is because someday that source will be you and me and everyone, right? We're all sources of non-inclusive behavior sometimes. And so we want to create a culture that helps people learn and grow from their mistakes rather than immediately, canceling and condemning them for making mistakes. Now, of course, there are going to be instances where condemning someone or canceling them is appropriate. I mean, Kenji and I don't lie awake at night worrying about the plight of Harvey Weinstein. I think there are instances where a harsher approach is called for, but because all of us make these kinds of errors in our everyday lives, we think that that sort of generosity is an important starting point. It's also an important starting point because people enter these dialogues from different places, right? It's much easier to know how to navigate all of these difficult conversations about identity if you've been steeped in that world for your entire life, whereas not everyone is exposed to all of the diversity of the society growing up and may not be able to navigate some of these issues until they learn. And so we want to create that kind of a learning culture. And I think for all those reasons, we think, start from a place of generosity, show the person that you're learning to, like Kenji did, that you make mistakes as well, and that's more likely to lead the other person to actually grow and improve past the mistakes that they've made.
When you are building on that a little bit, Kenji, do you think of this book as like an allyship 101, or is it a 201, or where do we enter? And if we want to be better allies, which is actually, read the book first of all, but if you could summarize sort of what do you say to someone who says, I want to be a better ally?
Yeah, so the book is sort of divided up into sort of 7 principles, and we think that all of those are relevant to good allyship. So the first one is just how to avoid the 4 most common conversational traps. And then the second and third chapters are about how to build your resilience and your curiosity, which we think are the 2 sort of cardinal virtues of allyship. The 4th and the 5th chapters are about how to apologize when you've wronged somebody and how to disagree respectfully with someone when you simply can't, offer them the allyship that they're seeking. And then the 6th and the 7th chapters are how to be a good ally to the affected person, obeying what we call the kind of platinum rule. And then the 7th principle is the one that you just discussed with David, the importance of being an ally to the source.
So good things in there for whether you are someone who's thought about this issue a lot or are really new to the whole topic and thinking about how to do it better. I love the chapter on apologies, David. So can you talk about what makes a good apology and how your definitions are different than what is out in common public culture?
Yeah, apology, this was a fun chapter for us to write because, apologies can seem quite amorphous, sort of how on earth do I put together this authentic apology? But we actually think that they can be broken down into a relatively easy to remember 4-step process, which we call the 4 R's of an apology, which is recognition, responsibility, remorse, and redress. And so recognition is about recognizing the harm. So often people fail to recognize the harm by using what we call an if-pology. So they might say, I'm sorry if you're offended, or I'm sorry if you're upset, or I'm sorry if you take it that way. And that's kind of suggesting that the harm is somehow uncertain, or you might not have actually caused harm. So recognition is about recognizing that. Responsibility is about taking personal responsibility for causing the harm. So this one, people often mess up by issuing a but-pology. So they'll say, I'm sorry, but I was tired. I'm sorry, but I didn't mean it. I'm sorry, but I'm not a racist, something like that. And so a classic example of this is Roseanne Barr, who famously wrote a highly racist tweet. And then when she got in trouble for it, she said, "Oh, I'm sorry, but it was 2 a.m. and I was Ambien tweeting." And so that kind of course, didn't take responsibility. It just sort of blamed it on the Ambien, right? So that's the second step. And
Wait, you have to talk about the other example, though, because my favorite person in the world is next to you, Kenji, but is Tina Fey, and you talk about how a good apology works there, right?
Yes, exactly. And so she sort of did do a butt-pology by sort of saying, you know, "I'm sorry, but I didn't mean it," right? Or "I'm sorry, but my intentions were good," right? And when she was called out for one of her mistakes. But eventually what she did is she gave an apology that followed the 4 R's, right? Recognition, responsibility, remorse, and redress. This is when some episodes of her TV show came out that had actors in blackface, right? And she ended up apologizing for that, taking personal responsibility for it, expressing remorse for the error, and then asking NBC to remove the episodes from circulation. And so that's the redress component, which is to actually take tangible steps to repair the harm so that an apology is not just all talk. And so we like Tina Fey's apology there because she kind of completed the 4 R's without even realizing it. And I think that's what, we really like about that.
I think an interesting thing about that is it makes it easier to accept the apology too, because there's an action, and I've really thought about that, how hard it is sometimes just to say that's okay when you don't really feel like that's okay, but you have to say something when someone says I'm sorry. And so if there is an action, then it's really great after an apology if you can say thank you. So really the goal is to do an apology that you can say thank you to, like thank you for doing that.
Absolutely.
When you think about the pop culture today, and there's this whole idea that like we're not allowed to disagree with anyone, and can you even sort of call people or to have a real conversation anymore? What do you think about that, and how does your book help with that?
Yeah, so we sort of die on the hill of saying that you have to be allowed to disagree, right? So, our heart broke one day when, after one of the events at our center, one of our favorite students came up to us and said, like, I made a comment, during this presentation, and one of my colleagues thought, that I was being sexist, but I disagreed with her. Was I allowed to do that? I was like, for goodness sakes, this is like an institution of higher learning. You're training to be a lawyer. You have to be able to disagree. But we got where he was coming from, because sometimes these conversations seem so sensitive, and disagreement may feel like you're hurting someone you really care about, or you're risking getting canceled yourself. So both on other regarding and self-regarding grounds, you might hesitate before you disagree. So our thinking about disagreement really hinges on the notion that not all disagreements are created equal, and even people who are having the disagreement may be at very different places in how they experience a disagreement. So we have this thing called the controversy scale. So if you can imagine like a scale moving from left to right, where, and this is not a political spectrum or anything like that, it's just, intensity scale. So the least intense kind of disagreement is one about sort of tastes, right? So if you and I disagree about what our favorite Netflix show is, or David,
or how great my shoes are.
Well, no one could disagree about that, right? So, or David and I disagreed about, what, flavor of ice cream we like better, right? Then those kinds of disagreements are like razzing each other, right? We'll get closer rather than further apart by having those disagreements. As we move one step over to facts, and I really mean like journalistic who, what, when, where, why facts, rather than kind of fights over values by proxy. So we're not talking about like alternative facts or anything like that. We're really just talking about like what happened.
That's sad we have to define a fact.
But in those instances, it may be a little bit hotter, and like we may have like a really vigorous disagreement about what really did just happen there, but still it's not going to be as intense. We find that as we move over into policies and then values, things get hotter and hotter. And then at the furthest extreme, right, we have equal humanity. If one person feels like you're disagreeing with their right to exist on the planet or your right to belong in society, then they're going to take that, really personally. Sometimes both sides think about it in that way. In a weird way, when both parties feel like their equal humanity is in question, like at least they're in the same point on the controversy scale. So like they understand the intensity of the disagreement, where we find that people don't often understand the intensity of the disagreement is when one side is operating over here and the other person is operating over there. So, if one person is saying, oh, I'm just going to bring an argument to you about how, quotas for women on boards is a terrible thing, or affirmative action is a terrible thing, or something like that, and I'm just going to argue in good faith as a matter of policy that that's a terrible thing. The person on the other side of that debate, who might be the beneficiary of that quota or that affirmative action program, might feel that that's a hit at their equal humanity and their right to belong, right, in the community, of like somehow your standing in this community, maybe even, right, is called into question by that. So we're actually not saying that when you have that gap, that the person who is to the left of the person who is getting hurt needs to move, right? Just the person who is on the kind of less kind of incendiary point on the scale has to acknowledge, right, that the other person might hear and experience this based on their life experiences and other aspects of their identity, the conversation differently. So in those instances, the hope is to say to the other person, like, I understand that these words, come from me as a matter of policy, right, or facts or what have you, but for you, they may land as a matter of your equal humanity, and I'll try to be respectful of that in this conversation, and please, call me in, right, if I'm saying something that hits you in the wrong way, right? And that's such a powerful form of interpersonal respect in the conversation that I think it does an enormous amount. Just to take a personal example to, again, show I'm learning too. I was on the other side of this prior to 2015 when I was sort of going around the country arguing for same-sex marriage as somebody who is currently in a same-sex marriage, right? And I was arguing it as a constitutional law professor, and my debate partners would often say to me, we know that you're in a same-sex relationship, so this is really personal to you, but we want you to sort of leave that aside when we get on the stage, like just put your constitutional law professor hat on and argue this as a matter of the Equal Protection Clause or the Due Process Clause, and leave your personal priors aside. And I remember thinking in like green room after green room after I was like exhorted not to bring my personal priors into it, thinking like, of course, I'm capable of doing that, and I will do that. I think that it's actually fair for everyone for me to make this as an intellectual argument, and I think I can win that intellectual argument, right? But I kept thinking, like, you could have done yourself so much good, party opposite, in that green room if you had just said to me, I'm making this argument as a matter of policy, right? But I understand that for you it may implicate your equal humanity and your feeling that you're equal in this society that we have. And so as we have the conversation, we're going to have it as a question of facts and values, but I just want to acknowledge that this may have a different valence for you. I don't think that they would have to have surrendered any of their substantive arguments in order to make that statement, but curiously, not a single one of them did, right? So I think it's really, really important, right, to think about like that, how that kind of spirit of generosity actually costs you nothing in the end in terms of the substantive arguments that you can make, except for it forces you to see the other human being as a human being, right? And I don't think anything is lost in that.
I think a lot of times people do, they just don't have the words to say it in that moment. And I think what is helpful about your book is there's so many examples of situations we've all been in, and having, an example of the words and how to arrange them just the way you did about the green room is so inspiring. It's so helpful to think like, I could do that. Those aren't, crazy words. Those can come out of my mouth. There's a lot of, in your book, David, that is about, talking about how to, setting up some of these situations and giving people ideas for, here's a way you could approach it. Another thing that you talk about, though, is when to know, how to get involved. When we see something happening, and you can just, keep on going down the hallway, or, you think, well, I'm going to stop, but then what am I going to do? What am I going to say? How do you decide on, when to intervene? What should we do?
Yeah, this is a really important question because we distinguish in the book between two different kinds of allyship or being an ally. So a lot of the principles that we've been talking about of disagreeing respectfully and apologizing authentically, I mean, those are really just about being a good human being, essentially, that kind of form of allyship. But of course, there are other instances where it's more of an active intervention. I spot something else going on, right? I'm sitting on a bus and I see that someone is being targeted because of their race, and I have to decide, well, do I speak up in this moment, right? Or I'm in a meeting and there's a woman being constantly interrupted and having her points appropriated by other men in the meeting. Do I kind of step in, in her defense in that meeting? And that's a much more active form of allyship. And so we have a whole chapter devoted to that where we talk about what we call the platinum rule, or we didn't coin the term platinum rule, but we're using it for this purpose, which is that, I think everyone's familiar with the basic premise of the golden rule of, treating other people as you would want to be treated. When we get over into the allyship context, we want people to remember that people are often very different from who we are, and so the way that they want to be treated is not necessarily the way that I would want to be treated in that situation. And so it's really important to actually use the informed empathy of trying to get into that other person's skin and think about, from their perspective, how would they want to be helped, not how would I want to be helped in that situation. And so we invite the reader to really consider two questions, a few questions, but the two of the most important ones are, first of all, just think about whether or not this person actually wants your help in the first place, right? Because there are some instances where it could be patronizing to help. There are some studies, social science studies, showing, for example, that when black students are taking a word puzzle and white helpers come in to offer unsolicited help for them on the word puzzle, that actually makes them feel worse about their own self-worth and their own competence because they didn't ask for the help, and it's sort of suggesting that they can't hack it on their own. So I think taking that first step to think, would this person want my help in this situation, is important. And then secondly, is the kind of help that I am going to offer this person the right kind of help? And so again, people can sometimes barrel in and think, well, any help is good enough help. And so we talk in the book about a range of ways that allies to the Black Lives Matter movement tried to intervene. And often it was very sort of cringy, clumsy interventions, right? So we give the example of a celebrity, Lily Reinhart, who took a photo on Instagram, and it said, it was kind of a topless photo, and it said, "Now that my side boob has got your attention, demand justice. Breonna Taylor's murderers have not been arrested," right? And, in case you think that's just a Lily Reinhart problem, we also talk about a social media influencer, Benno Peters, who similarly took a photo of his abs and said, "Rest in peace, George Floyd," right, as the caption for his Instagram photo of his abs. And so again, I just think, these are obviously extreme examples. Most people don't do that. But we use it as an illustration for sometimes when we're barreling in as allies, we kind of do it clumsily without stopping to consider, is this really a form of intervention that, from the perspective of the people that I'm trying to help, actually helping them? And at least considering those two questions will get you part of the way to deciding how to intervene in these situations.
You have to tell the SNL. Do you want to do it, Kenji, or do you want to do it, David? the white savior sketch.
Yeah. Do you want me? Okay, so this is actually my...
You guys know the white savior sketch from SNL? Okay, it's so funny. You have to go look it up.
So I'm a huge sort of late night with Seth Meyers fan, but my all-time favorite thing of his is a trailer that he does called White Savior. It's a spoof trailer of a movie that doesn't exist, but it would be hilarious if it did. And it's him playing this character, Jack, and a black woman played by Amber Ruffin. And the black woman is introduced as like, brilliant, sort of award-winning scientist, civil rights leader, and cellist, right? And then he's introduced as Jack, the man who was white while she did it. So throughout the entire trailer, it's like this cringe-worthy, but also like incredibly familiar sort of series of interventions that he makes, where she's giving a huge civil rights speech, and then he goes in and completely unnecessarily like lowers the mic towards her mouth, and he says like, she could make the speech because I was here, I did that, right? And then, onward and onward, right? That when, another individual like is sort of being kind of hostile towards her, he like steps in and is completely the savior, and then unsolicited just punches a guy in the face, and then she's standing there saying, "I could never have done that, but I also didn't want you to do that." And then finally there's like a whites only sign outside of a restroom, and then he says, oh, that's outrageous, and he gets up there, and then you hear a Sharpie squeaking, and then when he gets down, it says, whites only and amber. So he solves it for her, right, but for nobody else. And so it's just like unbelievable because it is sort of simultaneously so extreme and so familiar, right? So that's, don't be like Jack in this trailer, I think is the thing. And on a more serious note, although it's still pretty comedic, right? It says at one point, as trailers do, right, made by the creators of, and then all these like movies pop up, and it's like all these movies like The Help or The Blind Side or like The Green Mile or what have you that do have all these white saviors in them, right? And you're just like, oh, like a lot of the culture I've been consuming is this trope, right? But it wasn't produced as parody. It was produced as like a Oscar-winning blockbuster kind of movie, right? And so it just shows you that we can only parody things that are very familiar to us, and unfortunately the white savior narrative or the ally savior narrative in general is very familiar to us. And I guess if I could riff off of that, I would say just a couple of things. David has talked, I think, really wonderfully about these first two premises of the platinum rule, which is make sure the ally, make sure the affected person actually wants help, and make sure that you're giving them the help that they ask for. Right, but our third premise there is make sure that you're not hurting the affected person in the name of helping them. And that's often kind of an eyebrow raiser because people think like, well, I'm here to help, so how could I possibly be burdening the affected person? And we ask readers to watch out for two unintentional burdens because we say, of course, you can help and hurt somebody at the same time. And these are kind of cognitive burdens and emotional burdens. So oftentimes when we go into savior mode, we can sort of burden the other person by saying, for example, cognitively, like, educate me, about your group. So in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, one of our colleagues came to us and said, like, I'm exhausted because as a black man, like, this is like having 40 of my best friends wake up after a 400-year coma, asking to be briefed on what happened in the last 400 years. I'm exhausted as it is, I'm a little traumatized, and so the last thing I need to do is to like run these seminars educating all my incredibly well-meaning, friends on, how to be a better ally to me, right? So, and Damon Young, the writer in Brooklyn, put this, I think, even more pungently, where he said, after the murder of George Floyd, a lot of people were coming up to him as a black man, and he had never spoken to them before in his life, but they were saying, oh, we know you're a writer, like, and so I'd really like you to educate me about what's going on and with race relations in this country and what can I do and give me a syllabus and this and that. And he said, and I'll never forget this, Jane, I doubt that the Roadrunner, after a day of outrunning and out-scheming Wile E. Coyote, wants to go home and explain coyote supremacy to the liberal hood. Yeah, and I thought, that's pretty good. And then the other kind of burden we can place on people is the emotional one, and this is the kind of allied tears phenomenon. This as white tears, but I think it applies to anyone in a dominant group who's listening to an affected person as an ally, where it can get really real, and we can feel, and from the best parts of ourselves, very, very emotional. So I myself have teared up or gotten emotional when I've heard somebody give testimony about what has happened to them as an affected person. That could be sexual assault, that could be Black Lives Matter, that could be any number of things, right? But I have to remember that if I'm really there as an ally, I have to be really careful about what happens when I tear up or have a visible emotional response, which is that a lot of the attention in the room, particularly if I'm a senior respected member of the community, can drift away from the affected person and towards me, right? So in those cases, I'm not as hardcore as Robin DiAngelo because my understanding is that her advice is that when the person can't control themselves, she forcibly escorts them from the room. So, whether or not I wish I could be that way, I don't know, but I'm just not that guy, so I'm not advocating that. But I am sort of making the case for self-regulation, which she also makes in her book, White Fragility, which is to say, when you as an ally find yourself having that strong reaction, just think, is it really proper for me as an ally to be siphoning emotional energy away from this person? So people turn to you, and you're not the affected person because you're having an emotional response. You can just say, I'm just reacting to the powerful testimony, right, that the affected person just gave. But I can handle it. Can we just redirect our attention where it belongs? Or if I'm really unable to keep it together, just exit the room, gather myself, and then come back when I'm really ready to be there as an ally. So both cognitively and emotionally, I think we have to be really careful when we're in that savior mode, not to like unintentionally and with the best intentions actually, because these actually, I want to learn, I feel for you. Those are actually really positive emotions, but they can actually backfire in these interactions if we don't watch out for them.
Yeah, how do we think about that in terms of, I read your book a while ago, and then I read it again a couple weeks ago, and even today I'm thinking, oh, I forgot all that good stuff that I should be remembering. What is your thought on how people can, what would your dream be about how people can go out and actually use the things that you have talked about in your book, and what if we forget, and what if we screw up? What are your words of encouragement for like, keep going, keep trying?
Well, we like to think of this as a little bit like learning a language, where you are probably, as an adult learning a new language, never going to achieve full native level fluency, and you're still going to make mistakes as you go, but you will certainly get better with practice. And so our kind of primary directive is, practice, practice, practice. So a lot of the conversations right now that you might be running away from, hiding under your desk to avoid, try actually engaging in those conversations.
With real people?
With real people. Yes. And, part of the reason, again, why we believe it's so important to be generous toward those who make mistakes is so that people keep practicing. Because one of the reasons why people stop practicing these conversations is that they mess it up once, they get a bad response from somebody, or they feel so ashamed of how badly they did in the conversation that they run away and decide, I don't want to have any more of these conversations again. Whereas our hope is that if we create a culture where people are actually sort of generous toward each other and the mistakes that they're making, that will create the kind of environment in which people are willing to practice and try again when they stumble. So I think that's sort of one point. The other point is that we hope, at least with our book as a resource, and there are other books that have written on these subjects as well, of course, so we certainly don't think ours is like the only one to refer to, but we hope that our book is going to be the kind of toolkit that people can pick up when they need it. So we've really written it to try to be a kind of multi-tool where people can apply a strategy. If they forget about it, pull it off their shelf, look at it again, try it again, and really engage with it, And so I hope that at least our contribution to this literature is to give people a toolkit that they can kind of keep returning to over and over again.
I really love that. I think it reminds me of Brene Brown's, thing that she says that shame can't survive the light of connection. And it's, maybe another thing that we can do as allies is find a shame buddy that you can call and say, I said this really stupid thing today, and who will listen to you without judgment. And I actually think your book can be that if you don't have somebody to call immediately, or it's in the middle of the night and you just woke up, that it is a way to not feel alone. That look at all of these other examples of things, and you can feel like, okay, this is what I can do differently next time, which is to have a plan. I think that's sort of what is hopeful to me about the book, is I've done a lot of the things in there that, oh, I wish I hadn't said that, or why did I do that? And that is a hard place to sit. But if you know, number one, that other people have done it too, and number two, that you have some, a plan for what you can do differently next time, that is to me a big source of hope.
Absolutely. And we talk in the book about this theory called ring theory from the psychologist Susan Silk, where she asks you to imagine that a person going through a crisis has a series of circles around that person, concentric circles, right? And so imagine if you have a medical diagnosis or something, and I'm offering you support. I have to imagine that you're in the middle circle, I'm in the circle one step removed, and then I have my own family and friends in the circles out even further, right? So you can keep drawing concentric circles to get all the relationships, going out from you. And the rule that Susan Silk offers is to comfort in and dump out, meaning I shouldn't be dumping all of my negative emotions and my shame on you when I'm trying to support you as the person going through a crisis. And we apply that model to this area as well of allyship, which is, if I'm trying to support someone who's experiencing bias, discrimination, a lot of pain of exclusion, Now, I might have my own emotional issues to be dealing with, right? I might feel guilt that I made a mistake, or I might be feeling angry or fearful or any number of things. But what I shouldn't do is burden you as the affected person with all of those emotions. What I can do is go back to my shame buddy, as you were talking about it, or someone in my own outer circle, right? So my husband or, my friends, and I can talk about all my painful emotions to them, right? And that's okay. We think you should be getting that kind of support as an ally. You just need to know who to get it from.
Absolutely. I think that is, I have a friend who was just recently diagnosed with breast cancer, and she asked her immediate friends not to tell other people. I won't tell you her name, so I'm not violating that tonight. But, a friend she told said, hey, I was having lunch with, this other mutual friend, and it was really hard on me that I couldn't tell her why I was so sad. And, it's like, wow, her answer there was, wow, you should really talk to your therapist about that. But, in that sense, locating yourself on the geography of harm is so helpful, because otherwise, it's hard to do things where you're going to be received properly, even if what's in your heart is helpful. And then when you get that negative response, it's so disorienting. But if you can keep that map in your head and sort of say, what ring am I in this situation? In some situations, you can be in the center, as you've pointed out, depending on what's happening. And at the same time, you can also be on the outer ring of somebody else's circle. So they're concentric circles. There's not just one.
Absolutely.
So it's a helpful framework for life in general, in addition to sort of wanting to be good allies, which is a good segue to, you're both parents. So when you think about your kids and how you want to help them to be good allies, what is like the most important thing that you think about?
I'm just grinning because I literally feel like I'm committing human rights violations with my children, because I make them, off of our apologies chapter, I have their stuffed animals at night apologize to each other, and then ask my children what was wrong with each apology, right? So I might not be the best person to ask about how I combine my scholarship with my parenting. So David, over to you.
Because your kids are much younger.
Yeah, so I would say I'm not so good on the apology front, because I have a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old. So when they need to apologize, it's usually, say sorry. And then they just say the buzzword sorry. And I'm like, okay, good. That was it. So I don't make them go through the 4 elements of an apology, maybe when they're a little bit older.
Do you worry about sort of whether they will find good allies in the world, and how to equip them to be good allies?
Absolutely. They're still, so young, so it's hard to think forward in that way. But I do hope that we're entering a world where, as I mentioned, there's so much more awareness of these issues now, and the education on issues of diversity and inclusion is just happening younger and younger. And so there are programs, right? Even in my son, the 5-year-old's in his elementary school, there's a diversity and equity inclusion committee at that school. They have programs to teach kids, lessons around inclusive behavior. And so my hope is that this generation that's growing up now are going to be so much more steeped in the language of allyship, and so much more able to offer the kinds of support that we're talking about now, that I hope that they're going to have, options as they go through their lives. And hopefully we can be, as parents, allies to them too.
And I also think on a more kind of, a serious note, like than what I led with earlier, I do think that things appear so young that are just eternal issues for us as human beings. And one of them was, so without betraying her confidences, like, my daughter tried to intervene in an allyship situation, and then I was the outer ring, right? Because she was beating herself up for something she had done at school that ended up blowing up in her face. And so she came back, and so we talked about it, right? And it really struck me that the stuff that David was talking about earlier so eloquently is true, when you're, 11, which is where she is now, and it's true when you're anywhere else in life, right? Where the two things that she needed were, first of all, like, not to get shamed by other people, right? So this notion of like, oh, I can have as much self-compassion as I want, but if other people are gonna be punitive and cancel me, then that's not gonna work, right? Like, I can't do this on my own. So that's the, please be an ally to the source. That's someday gonna be you. Like, be gentle, be generous, be empathetic, except for in extreme cases or where the person doesn't wanna learn, right? But the other thing that David said that I thought was so great was that oftentimes we're our own harshest critics, and you were sort of eliciting this from him as well, of like, oftentimes it's not like some external body that's censoring us. We're just like in bed staring at the ceiling at night, like beating ourselves up like into the wee hours for something we did or said. And so I think it takes a really long time for us to realize that our shame is not a gift to anyone. It's not a gift to the affected person. It's not a gift to ourselves, right? And Brene Brown, who we quoted earlier and we quote in the book, like makes a sharp distinction between shame and guilt, where she says shame is about who you are and is generally not productive. Guilt is about what you did, right? And is generally kind of a good kick in the pants to get you to do better, right? So I think we need both sides of that. Like, I think that we need to have that kind of self-compassion and that grace and gentleness with ourselves. But I think that we also need it from our communities, right? Because we can't do it all on our own. So it's something that, you know, we have to be on our side, but other people have to be on our side too, when we're trying to be good people of goodwill who are trying to grow to a better place as allies.
I love that, the allies to the allies. Okay, I want to go to some of the questions that I see coming in. Unfortunately, I am too vain to bring my reading glasses, so we'll see how this goes. Okay, in my workplace, the diversity committee is voluntary, and I notice that it's powerless people who are the ones most passionate and interested in supporting diversity from within, and also outwardly towards our client/community. Learning how to apologize appropriately is good. How do we get the higher ups interested and aware that they have a part in the solution too?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one of the points that I don't think we've hit squarely in this conversation is that we really wrote this book especially targeted to people who are entering these conversations from a higher power position. And so we define higher power to include people who are higher power in an organization. So it might be a manager or some a senior organizational leader or a teacher or what have you. But it can also include people entering from a higher power position because of their social identity. So an ally, a male ally entering conversations about gender, for example, or a white ally entering conversations about race. So I think part of our approach to this is we think that it's really important to lean into this concept of allyship, because that truly is the framework that everyone, regardless of their position, can get involved in. I think it's regrettable that so much of the conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion, there is that burden placed on the people who are most affected and most marginalized to always be the ones speaking up and championing these issues. And I think, one of my hopes for this book is that it will empower more people who are in those, higher up positions to care about these issues and to feel like they have a voice in these conversations. And so even people who are well-meaning retreat in fear from these conversations. And I do hope that sort of turning down the fear factor and giving people these tangible skills might also help them show up to some of these conversations.
I would also buy a copy of this book and just leave it on their desk. It seems like that identity has become a lot more important to consider in the last few years. While I think it's critical that we respect what people need, is there a reason why identity has become more front and center in our culture?
Yeah, I think it's that we have really seen the fruits of many, many social movements coming together, and that the United States has just become more aware of diversity that's always existed within its ranks, and objectively has gotten more diverse, right, with regard to, say, patterns of immigration or longevity, making us more generationally diverse, right? So I think that there's a demographic change, and then I think that there's also like a normative change of like it's no longer acceptable when we're barreling towards becoming a majority-minority nation on the basis of race, for example, to say, no, there's only one story that matters, right? Or there's only one perspective that matters.
Jade, I should also mention there's someone standing behind them.
Oh, gosh, okay. Well, that is a good time to go to you. Sorry, I couldn't see you.
That's okay. I couldn't synthesize my text while listening at the same time. I think this is more of a personal question to David.
Could you speak into the mic?
Yeah. Yeah. How's this? Is this better? This is somewhat of an Aussie to Aussie question that's been ruminating in my mind for a while. I've lived in the States for the last 5 years, so I've been a little bit detached to things back home, but I've been home once last year. And I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the learning curve that you talked about. I want to go back home and raise my kids back home, but I'm really scared to go back home because there seems to be, at least what I observe from family and friends versus the conversations I have here, a really big divide in that learning curve that you talk about. Australia seems to be really far behind, like 10 years, like we're at the infant stage of having these conversations versus here in the US, like what we're talking about tonight, right now. I asked a similar question to Robin DiAngelo when she was here a couple of weeks ago, and her response was, sharing from your experience and talking from yourself first, which I definitely bought, but the part I don't buy is the inherently Australian culturalism in it of everyone has a fair go, where the tall poppy syndrome is so deep, and if you share your own experience, how that comes off in that culture can come across as really condescending or patronizing. I wanted to know from your perspective, like I'm still not really buying some of these strategies of thinking about how that would translate. I'd be speaking a completely different language, and I don't know how to bring them in and how to, when, the default attitude is never talk about sex, politics, or religion at the table,
Yeah, it's a great question, and I do think that this book, has some limitations in the sense that, it's written within a particular cultural context and national context, and we do hope that it will travel abroad and that people will find useful insights in it, but it's always going to be, I think, a question as anyone reads it of thinking about how to adapt it to different cultural settings. I feel like one of the reasons why the United States is sort of more advanced, quote unquote, in having these conversations is just simply because of the kind of demographic change that Kenji was referring to, that I feel like Australia is on that same trajectory. So, if you go to Australia now, it's much wider than what you would see in, the United States walking around this, but it's changing. So I feel like it's sort of if you wound the clock back in the United States. And so I think the conversation similarly on diversity, equity, and inclusion, when I left Australia about 10 years ago, it basically didn't exist as a discourse. Like I didn't even know what diversity, equity, inclusion was. Now it's a very important conversation in Australia. Like there are a lot of people who have DEI jobs. It's being talked about much more in the media. Again, I agree with you that it's further behind, but I think there's more of an openness in the conversations I have with people out there to at least start the conversation. And so I think it's all about kind of navigating your way through some of those other kind of cultural dimensions that you're talking about, and happy to talk offline more about, tall poppy syndrome and other very Australia-specific kind of ideas, because I do have some thoughts. But yeah, I think I'm not as hopeless, in terms of communicating this to Australia. I think it's just that we're probably, as you say, about a decade or so behind the United States in thinking and talking about these issues.
But I would say that, I have parents who were born in Korea, and I immigrated when I was 4. And some of these things are conversations that, like, how do you have these conversations with your parents, right? It's not, so it's not so much halfway around the world as just across your dinner table sometimes. And I think some of the advice around resilience and curiosity, and especially the empathy for the source. With my dad, you have to have a lot of empathy for the source. That there's a lot of, just day-to-day practical thinking that I think, it's helpful to, to put in practice. Okay, let's do one more from here. Sometimes it's unclear that whether the other party is capable of giving respect to your experience, but sometimes a gently delivered pathos argument is the thing that gives them a new perspective. How do we hold the potential harm or repercussions of being vulnerable, especially in a professional context, but also weigh its potential effectiveness?
Yeah, I love that. So I assume that this is a question that is coming from a would-be ally in confronting a source. And obviously, you know, I'll say the kind of most self-evident things first, which is like you're allowed to engage in self-care and not, you know, make yourself more vulnerable than you're comfortable being. So I'd go back to we want people to be resilient in the face of discomfort, but we don't think it should teeter over into distress. So I'd make that point first.
But walk right up to the point of distress.
Yeah.
Go through vulnerable to the point of distress and then take a half step back.
Yeah, and I think that oftentimes it's like when you're talking to the source, you know, it's really important to gauge what they can bring too, right? I think oftentimes I think vulnerability is just another word for imbalance of like how we feel when we are exposing a lot of ourselves and the other person is not, right? And so if both sides are being vulnerable, it actually ceases to feel that dangerous, and so the vulnerability goes away on its own. So I think a lot of it is in how you address the source and what you view the source's capabilities to be. So when we say we want you to be an ally to the source, for example, we're not talking about, this is David's earlier comments about not losing sleep over Harvey Weinstein, right? Not to single him out necessarily, but like we have this notion of you know, if the person has engaged in truly egregious behavior, if the person seems to have no interest, you know, and even if they haven't engaged in egregious behavior and getting better, then you don't really have an obligation to be their ally, even if they are the source of non-inclusive behavior. So we want to put some really strict guardrails around that to say, like, this is like the 20-60-20 rule where 20% are diehard advocates of D&I, 20% are ideologically opposed, and 60% are in the middle. So if you know that somebody's in the stuck 20, then you don't actually need to engage with them as an ally, including making yourself vulnerable to them.
If the person seems like they're in the 80, though, do you think that we have an obligation to be an ally? Is there a moral obligation? By the way, I don't know if you all have read The Ethicist in the New York Times, that Kenji used to be one of the people you would ask ethical dilemmas to. So here, do we have a moral obligation to be an ally?
I think we do, as long as those conditions are met. So long as a person is not engaged in egregious behavior, and so long as a person's a person of goodwill who is trying to get better, then I do think we have a moral obligation, both because of the reciprocity point that David was making earlier, which is someday we are going to be that person ourselves. We're going to be the source. So like, what kind of system are we going to build, right, sort of behind the veil, so to speak, right, if we don't know where we're going to land? And I think ethically we would want other people to reach out to us. Like, do I want to be sitting in my office stewing over having misgendered a student, right, all alone, like worrying about getting canceled and, you know, going into the next class, like, you know, not sure where I stand in the community? Or do I want someone to knock on my door and say, hey, that wasn't great, you know, but, you know, I survived, you know, I did something very similar, and I'm still here, like, you know, tomorrow I'll do something very similar, and I hope then you're knocking on my door, offering to be my ally. You know, I think it's like, if you ask which world do you want to live in, I think most people would rather live in the second world, where somebody's knocking on their door, and that suggests that we do have an obligation, right, to extend that hand to the source of non-inclusive behavior, right, because that's how we would want to be treated ourselves.
I love that. The authoritarian part of me, like, loves the more direct, like, you should do this.
Always another question here.
Okay.
Hey there. So in some negotiations courses I've taken, one of the principles that they learned is that, like, any disagreement it's counterproductive to approach it from rights. Because if you're talking about your right and I'm talking about my right and they're opposed, it's not a position you can back away from. So I'm curious, like, do you agree with that kind of philosophy, and what strategies and techniques do you have for downgrading the temperature from a conversation around rights to a conversation around values?
Yeah, so in the sort of context of negotiation, I think that's, you know, is really helpful advice. In the book Getting to Yes, they talk about moving away from positions and focusing more on interests. So rather than I'm like stuck, on my corner, I'm actually offering, where I'm coming from underneath the position that I'm holding. And so I think that's good advice in negotiation. Unfortunately, in these disagreements, sometimes I think this really is about human rights and really feels like it is about rights to people. So as Kenji was saying before, with this controversy scale, sometimes for good reason, people feel that their equal humanity is implicated in these conversations. And I certainly don't want to tell those people, well, you need to sort of dial that down a bit and not treat it as implicating your rights and treat it as about some other thing. And I think for that reason, these kinds of disagreements can be really heated and very difficult to actually do respectfully. And sometimes the best that we can do is to extend that kind of empathy that Kenji was talking about before. Try to find, we have other tools in the disagreement chapter about doing things like trying to find commonalities that you might have with the other person. So not only focusing on the disagreements that you have with them, but also trying to find some areas where you have common ground so you're able to talk more productively. And also managing your expectations for the disagreement. So not thinking that when you're having a disagreement about things that are so fundamental that you're going to walk away from that with some negotiated outcome. Sometimes you're going to walk away from that having to kind of agree to disagree, and maybe the relationship will be intact and maybe it won't be intact. But yeah, so I think that the negotiation context is a little bit different from this context, but there are a few strategies you can employ to make it a little bit better.
And then I appreciated that ring conceptualization. Curious, what are some of the other social science, psychologic, ethical frameworks that your work is rooted in, and any other additional reading that was foundational for your work that you'd recommend beyond obviously your book?
Yeah, so we benefited a lot. I mean, we are not trained social scientists ourselves, but we find we work with social scientists, and we find a lot of wisdom in the social sciences. So, in fact, a lot of the examples that we gave earlier are, rooted in studies that we sort of left out to keep things a little bit more lively or interesting. But just to go back to one, when we were talking about making sure that you don't engage in saviorism and substitute your own preferences for the actual preferences of the affected person. It's not just like, Late Night with Seth Meyers skit. It's also a study by Katie Wang, where she has this wonderful thing where she has a hypothetical woman, Mary, who is blind, who is seeking directions to the bus station, and she asks two pedestrians for those directions. The first pedestrian says, no, that's way too difficult for you. You should just go home. I'm not going to help you. The second pedestrian says, oh, that's going to be challenging for you, but I'm headed in that direction myself. I'll take you, and begins to escort her to the bus station. This goes back to the platinum rule, because if you ask individuals who are sighted who help better, they'll say the second pedestrian by a landslide. In fact, that's where I was, when I first read the hypothetical. But if you ask individuals who are themselves visually impaired, like Mary, who help better, they'll say both forms of help were almost equally inappropriate, because both forms of help did not give Mary the help she was asking for, which was directions to the bus station, Instead, both of them sort of substituted their own judgment for her judgment, and that was where the affront lay. So that was actually kind of an aha moment for me, and sort of saying there's actual social science receipts, to back up this intuition that we should not, substitute our own judgments for other people's judgments. Just another example on the, helping people when they're the source of non-inclusive behavior and approaching them as if you're on the journey too. My favorite study here is done by Benoit Monin, where he talks about do-gooder derogation. So he says, if you approach somebody, let's say, make this real, I'm stewing in my office about, just having learned that I called on men more than I called on women over an entire sort of series of courses in constitutional law, and I'm sort of beating myself up about it. And let's say Jane comes into my office and says, Kenji, that was terrible, you're misogynistic, you're a horrible human being, but I'm really good at this stuff, and I deign to take you under my wing and help you grow past this mistake, So we actually don't probably need social science to tell me I'm not going to react well to that, but we do actually have social science that tells me that I'm not going to react well to that. Monin talks about what he calls do-gooder derogation, where if I'm approached by somebody even as an ally, and I know I'm the source, I know their conduct is better than mine and that they can help me, if they approach me with the attitude of I'm better than you, then my instinct is going to want to take them down a peg rather than trying to rise to their level myself. So the way in which he studied this was to look at vegetarians and meat eaters. And he said, if you're a meat eater, and I myself am a meat eater, if you ask me, what do you think of vegetarians? I'll say, I think vegetarians are amazing. I think they're ethical and humane, and I wish I could be a vegetarian myself. I wish I had the discipline, right? But, the landscape changes entirely if you ask me one question before you ask for my assessment. So if you ask me the question, Kenji, as a meat eater, what do you think vegetarians think of you? Then my assessment of vegetarians drops precipitously, because where my mind goes is, oh my gosh, vegetarians are judging me as unworthy. They're talking down to me. And so immediately I say, oh, they're kind of sanctimonious or not as good as they think they are. There are so many other ways in which we can save our planet or our ecosystem or what have you, right? So what he says is be really careful, right, about how you approach people when you want to change their behavior, because going to them and saying, as Jane would do, Kenji, that wasn't great. You can still call out the behavior and should, right? But listen, I did something very similar in the past, and I survived to tell the tale. And in future, right, I will make sure that, in the near future, I'll probably do something very similar to what you did today, and then I hope you're knocking on my door. So we sort of skated over it in the interests of kind of keeping it conversational, but we really did sort of, and you weren't saying I wasn't, I'm probably being unnecessarily defensive here, but we went quite deep, right, into the research to make sure that we had the social science receipts so that you could trust, the advice that we were giving.
Well, I think we could have this conversation all night, but given the time, I would just want to say I trust the advice that you were giving. I'm really grateful to have it out in the world, and one of the highest compliments I can give is when acknowledging when somebody does something to make other people feel not as alone. And allyship is such a tricky place to be, and a lot of us can feel alone in the situation. And so thank you for helping us not feel so alone. Oh, by the way, can you guys hang out for a sec? I want to do an Ellen-style selfie with you guys, so hang on. Just like Ellen. Oh, yes, and they are signing books